It seems to me that I have always known this. I came into this world knowing that you become what you think about, whether you want it or not. I was really very blessed. I lived in an orphanage until I was 10, in a series of foster homes with my older brother, but he was sick quite a bit. He was very anemic, and I just had to help him. I can remember when I lived down in Mount Clemens, Michigan, with a lady. Her name was Mrs. Scarf, and she had a lot of children would come and go from there. And I was in a foster home because the circumstances at that time were such that my father had walked out on his family, and I was born in the Depression, and there was no welfare and things like that in those days. So people just helped each other out. My mother was working as a candy girl in Detroit, on the east side of Detroit, earning $17 a week, and she just didn't have the money and wasn't able to provide for her children. So we lived out at this one particular place, and I can remember whenever a new student, a new child would come to the house, they would say, "Go find Wayne me." And I would be out in the back. They had orchards there, and this was no hardship. This was not a difficult thing for me. This was a great blessing, I think, in my life. These go earliest days, and I remember a girl named Martha came, and they were dropping her off for basically the same reasons that we were dropped off there, and they said, "Go find Wayne," and I came and I started talking to her. And she was crying, and she was all upset, and she was sad, and I was trying to convince her that she didn't have to be sad. That this was, I remember saying to her, "This is a great place. There are no parents here. You can do pretty much anything that you want. I mean, you've got a lot of freedom, and we're going to have a great time." And I can remember being in school, at the public school. I remember the teachers, one time we were out on the playground and all the kids were all upset. Then I said, "What's wrong?" And they said, "Well, that teacher said this is the worst class that she ever had." And she was so all upset, and she was angry, and she was hurting. And I said, "Well, why would you allow her opinion to have you feel like that? And this is her hardest day." And I can remember talking to other people about all you have to do is change the way you think, and it goes from being a miserable experience or tough experience or hard experience to one that you can do anything that you want with. My mother got our family all back together again when I was 9, almost 10 years old. I can remember her telling me what it was like when I was just a baby, when I was just like an infant, that I was the one child that could make everybody else laugh at times. He said one day we were waiting for a bus one time before I went into the orphanage, and she said a car came by, and it was in Detroit. And there was all this slush, and everybody had dirt on them and dirty snow, and we're laying in the ground, and everybody was crying. And she said, "You were upset and mad because our clothes were wet," and so on. And she said, "You just stood up and said, 'This is great. Isn't this wonderful? Look, we don't have to do this. We can turn back home and do something else.'" You see, just turning it into something positive. It's like the ability to be able to do something good regardless of the negativity. That was something. I can't remember a time in my life when I didn't know that if I really want to work on how I thought, that things just didn't have to be bad. I was the richest kid in the orphanage. I've talked about that many times in my lectures, that a snowstorm was a time we had snow shovels at home, and one of them had at the edges all curled up from hitting the curves, and you couldn't make any money with that one. So the other one, when it snowed, I would go downstairs and I would take the snow shovel and I would put it under my bed, and I sleep with it right with me so that nobody else would get it. And I would get up before everybody else got up, and I would go out and I would just shovel everybody else's snow. And then later on, and I just go knock on the door and just tell them that I shoveled their walk, and some would say thank you, and some would give me a dime, which doesn't sound like much, but that's $3,000 in today's money. When I found out that soda pop bottles, for example, were 2 cents each, that if you took them back, you could get 2 cents back. That was just like one of the great awakenings in my life, because I would follow people around who are drinking the Coca-Cola and say, "You almost done with that?" Then I collected the empty ones to make some money. It was just always easy to change, and all the other kids would be not having any money and complaining about not being able to have an abundance or be able to have some level of being able to buy themselves just a little donut or a Pepsi Cola or something. They couldn't figure it out, and it always seemed so easy to me that all you had to do was just look around and see the opportunities in anything. I just did it. It felt like suspicious in the beginning when looking at things in life as bad, but then I had the feeling that, hey, you know what you can take advantage of by changing the scenario, running in my mind by telling myself good things will happen. And it had nothing to do with whether there are opportunities there. There always are opportunities. I mean, I'm 67 years old. I have never ever been unemployed, or even you can't even deal with the concept of unemployment, but it isn't that I've had no job. I've always had more jobs than ever, and it isn't because I've been through all good economic times. There's been some pretty sour economic times over the last 50 years or so. I have never known how to think any other way than if you change the way you think about things, you can create whatever it is you want for yourself and your life. It's just a simple knowing. I mean, I've made a living talking about it. I've written lots of books about it and so on, but I have always lived it, practiced it, and I still do it today. The Power of Contemplation, Thomas Troward did some lectures on mental science way back in the 1907, 1908 in Scotland. And one of the things that he said is that the law of flotation was not discovered by the contemplation of the sinking of things. Before the 15th and 16th centuries, all the ships were made out of wood. Not because iron wasn't available and steel wasn't available, but because there was a belief that wood floated, so therefore you had to make ships out of things that floated. That's literally how it was believed, and then someone came along and said that it has absolutely nothing to do with what things are made out of. It has to do with the amount of water that is being dispersed. That's what determines whether something will float or not, and I think about that all the time because it's in the contemplation of what you desire that you create what it is that you want to have for yourself. It's in your willingness to contemplate it and nothing more, according to Troward and mental science. So that, I think about the Wright brothers, 100 or so years ago. It's like I said, the law of flying was not discovered by the contemplation of the staying on the ground of things. So that these were two people for me to figure out how to get an airplane by my limited knowledge of all that I would probably have contemplated to stay on the ground of things. But there's somebody came along and contemplated the idea that if you get enough speed going and you have the right design and you get pressure underneath something like this thing is going to lift up off the head. Somebody had to contemplate that idea, and everybody who contemplated that it wasn't possible, that it couldn't work, was a part of why flying didn't take place, because there was no new law discovered in the early part of the 20th century. Electricity was discovered by Thomas Edison. I mean, the ability to have electricity has always been there. Somebody has to contemplate. So it's like in your own personal life, your willingness to contemplate yourself as a person who is capable of attracting into your life what you want. See yourself in the good that you desire, having the kind of relationships that you want, being able to have abundance where scarcity always exists. All you have to do is begin the process by being willing to contemplate the presence of that in your life, the willingness to train yourself, your mind, to think positively, to bring about the wished results. And I've always been a person that I can remember throughout my life as someone who could contemplate myself being able to do things that most people couldn't. I can give you a good example. When I was little, when my mother got us all back together, and we were living in Detroit, and we got a new TV set. It was black and white. And there was a guy that was on TV. His name was Steve Allen, and he was on The Tonight Show, and I was 11, 12, 13 years old. And I used to stay up every night and watch The Tonight Show. Even though I went to go to school the next day, it was just something about that show and the characters and all the things that Steve Allen would do, and I would come down when I would be talking the next day. And I would be telling my mother and my two brothers that when I do The Tonight Show, this is what I would say. I wouldn't have said that. And I say the way he reacted, how he reacted, that I would have said this, and I used to do this, and my brothers and my mother would say, that's Wayne, and he thinks he's on The Tonight Show, and I would go up into my room, I would see myself doing The Tonight Show. Well, fast forward 30 years or whatever, I've written a book, You Erroneous Self, and The Tonight Show calls asking me if I would like to come on to the show. So I did the show like 37 times over a period of 3 or 4 years with all these different hosts, but Johnny Carson was on, and the first guest on the very first show when I did the show was Steve Allen. And it's like something clicked in me that I had contemplated, that as a child I had always had a knowing, and I can remember sitting there talking to Johnny about this thing, that Steve Allen was sitting there right next to me, and we were talking about that. By putting my attention on somebody, I wasn't some deliberate thing that I was doing when I was 11 or 12 years old that was designating that I was going to be a person who was going to be appearing on talk shows. 30 years from now, it was just an awareness and a willingness to contemplate myself in that kind of a place. And I think the power of contemplation is the thing that most people haven't harnessed yet. And when you harness it in your life, there's absolutely no limit to what you can attract into your life.